Tyreek Hill is no longer a member of the Miami Dolphins, and the official explanation the team gave for why they released one of the most dangerous offensive weapons in football is nowhere close to the real truth. The press release talked about mutual agreement to part ways and different visions for the future. But according to sources who've been inside Dolphins meetings over the past month, what actually led to Tyreek Hill's departure is so dark, so disturbing, and so carefully buried by layers of legal agreements and non-disclosure clauses that the full story may never be told publicly. This isn't about contract disputes. This isn't about declining performance or age catching up to an elite receiver. What happened between Tyreek Hill and the Miami Dolphins organization involves allegations that multiple sources describe as serious enough to trigger an internal investigation that consumed the entire front office for weeks, witness testimony from people inside and outside the building, and ultimately a decision by ownership that keeping Hill on the roster, regardless of his talent, was a risk they could no longer justify. The specific incidents that led to this decision are being kept under seal by legal agreements, but the details that are leaking out paint a picture that's going to shock everyone who thought they understood what was happening in Miami. The first sign that something was seriously wrong between Tyreek Hill and the Miami Dolphins came in late January when Hill missed 2 consecutive days of voluntary workouts without explanation or communication with the coaching staff. For most players, missing voluntary workouts wouldn't trigger alarms. But for a player of Hill's stature, someone who's been a consistent presence in off-season programs throughout his career, and who's been one of the most reliable veterans in Miami's locker room since arriving via trade from Kansas City in 2022, the unexplained absence was immediately concerning to coaches and teammates. According to sources familiar with what happened during those 2 days, the Dolphins coaching staff tried repeatedly to reach Hill through phone calls, text messages, and messages sent through his agent, but received no response. On the 3rd day, Hill showed up to the facility as if nothing had happened, offered no explanation for the absence, and, according to sources, became defensive and confrontational when coaches asked where he'd been. That incident alone wouldn't have been enough to trigger the chain of events that eventually led to Hill's release. But according to sources, it was during the investigation into those missed days that the Dolphins organization uncovered information about Hill's behavior and activities that raised far more serious concerns than a couple of missed workouts. Multiple sources who've been briefed on what the Dolphins discovered during that investigation describe it as information that involved potential violations of team policies, potential legal issues, and behavior that created what one source called an unacceptable risk to the organization and to other people in and around the building. The specifics of what the Dolphins uncovered are locked behind non-disclosure agreements that were part of the settlement between Hill and the organization that facilitated his release. But sources familiar with the general nature of the concerns say they involved incidents that occurred both on team property and away from the facility, that they involved interactions with multiple individuals, including at least one Dolphins employee, and that the behavior alleged was serious enough that once it was brought to ownership's attention, there was immediate consensus that Hill could not remain with the team, regardless of the football consequences. According to sources, the Dolphins conducted what they describe as a thorough internal investigation that included interviews with staff members, review of security footage from team facilities, examination of electronic communications, and consultation with outside legal counsel about the organization's obligations and potential liabilities. The investigation, according to sources, took approximately 3 weeks from the time concerns were first raised until the decision was made to release Hill. During that time, Hill continued to participate in team activities, which sources say was a deliberate decision by the organization to avoid tipping off media or creating speculation while they gathered information and determined next steps. But according to sources, during this investigation period, there were additional incidents involving Hill that reinforced the organization's growing belief that his continued presence was problematic. Sources describe situations where Hill allegedly became verbally aggressive with staff members over minor issues, where he allegedly made inappropriate comments to people in the building, and where his behavior created an environment that multiple employees reportedly described as hostile or uncomfortable in complaints filed with the team's Human Resources Department. When the investigation concluded and the findings were presented to Dolphins ownership, according to sources, the decision to part ways with Hill was made within hours. But the complications of actually executing that separation, given Hill's contract status, his public profile, and the sensitive nature of the allegations, required careful legal and public relations planning. According to sources, the Dolphins' legal team spent several days negotiating the terms of Hill's departure with his representatives, working to structure an agreement that would allow Hill to be released from his contract while protecting both parties from potential litigation and limiting what could be disclosed publicly about the reasons for the separation. The agreement that was ultimately reached, according to sources familiar with its terms, includes significant financial considerations, though notably less than what Hill would have been owed if he'd remained under contract through the duration of his deal. Sources say the settlement includes Hill receiving a portion of his remaining guaranteed money in exchange for his agreement to certain behavioral stipulations going forward and his acceptance of confidentiality provisions that prevent him from discussing the circumstances of his departure. The Dolphins, according to sources, also agreed to limit what they would say publicly about the reasons for the separation and to not oppose Hill's ability to sign with another team, though sources say the Dolphins did share certain information with the league office as required under NFL policies regarding player conduct issues. The public announcement of Hill's release was carefully worded to avoid specifics while technically being truthful. The Dolphins' statement talked about the organization and Hill having different visions for the future and reaching a mutual agreement to part ways. Hill's statement, released through his agent, thanked the Dolphins organization and fans and expressed his intention to continue his career elsewhere. Neither statement mentioned anything about investigations, allegations, or the real reasons behind the split. And both sides have been remarkably disciplined about maintaining that public narrative, with team officials consistently declining to elaborate beyond the official statements when asked by reporters.
But the reality behind those carefully crafted statements, according to sources who've been briefed on what actually happened, is far darker than a simple parting of ways between a player and a team. Sources describe an organization that felt it had no choice but to cut ties with one of its most talented players because the risk of keeping him, both legally and culturally, had become indefensible. The decision cost the Dolphins significantly in football terms, removing one of the league's most dynamic offensive weapons from a team that had built much of its offensive identity around Hill's speed and playmaking ability. But according to sources, from ownership's perspective, the cost of not making this move, whether measured in potential legal liability, damage to organizational culture, or risk to the safety and comfort of people working in and around the team, was far greater than any football consequences. The reaction within the Miami Dolphins locker room to Hill's departure has been complex and, according to sources, somewhat divided. Some players, according to sources, were shocked by the news and frustrated to lose a teammate they respected and enjoyed playing with, particularly players on the offensive side of the ball who benefited directly from Hill's presence on the field. But other players, according to sources, were not surprised by the departure, and in some cases were relieved, describing situations where they'd witnessed or heard about behavior from Hill that made them uncomfortable, but that they felt powerless to address given his status as a star player. Sources say head coach Mike McDaniel held a team meeting after Hill's release, where he acknowledged the football challenge of losing such a talented player, but also made clear that the organization's decisions are based on more than just what happens on the field, and that creating and maintaining a healthy culture is non-negotiable, regardless of someone's talent level.
The NFL league office has been notably quiet about the Hill situation, which sources say is intentional while they conduct their own review of whatever information the Dolphins provided them as part of the separation process. League policies require teams to report certain types of player conduct issues to the league office, and sources say the Dolphins did make such a report, though the specifics of what was reported remain confidential. The league's review will determine whether Hill faces any league-imposed discipline or restrictions on his ability to sign with another team. As of now, Hill is technically a free agent, available to be signed by any team, but sources say several teams that might otherwise have interest in acquiring a player of his caliber are hesitating while they wait to see what, if anything, emerges from the league's review or from the reporting that multiple media outlets are currently doing to try to uncover the full story. Tyreek Hill himself has remained largely silent since his release, beyond the initial statement through his agent. He has not done media appearances, has not posted extensively on social media beyond thanking Dolphins fans, and, according to sources, has been advised by his legal team to maintain a low profile while the dust settles. Sources close to Hill say he disputes some of the allegations that led to his departure and believes the Dolphins organization overreacted to situations that he characterizes differently than how they were characterized in the investigation. But those sources also acknowledge that Hill agreed to the confidentiality provisions of the settlement, which limits what he can say publicly, even if he wanted to defend himself against allegations that remain largely unknown to the public. The broader implications of the Hill situation extend beyond just one player and one team. This is now the second high-profile separation between Hill and an NFL team under circumstances that involved off-field conduct concerns. The first being his departure from Kansas City several years ago under circumstances that were similarly opaque to the public, but that sources at the time suggested involved concerns about Hill's behavior. The pattern raises questions about what due diligence teams conduct when acquiring players with known histories, about what support systems exist or should exist to help players modify problematic behavior, and about how the league and teams balance the competitive desire to employ the most talented players against the organizational and ethical imperative to maintain safe and healthy environments for everyone in and around their buildings. For the Miami Dolphins specifically, a Hill situation represents a significant failure in multiple dimensions. From a football perspective, they traded significant draft capital to acquire Hill and built their offensive system around his unique abilities, only to have that investment end prematurely under circumstances that generated no football return. From a cultural perspective, the organization failed either to properly vet Hill's fit with their culture before acquiring him, or to identify and address concerning behavior patterns before they escalated to the point where separation became necessary. And from a public relations perspective, the organization's inability or unwillingness to be transparent about why one of their star players is suddenly no longer with the team creates a vacuum that speculation and rumor fill, potentially damaging the organization's reputation in ways that might be worse than whatever truth they're trying to protect. As of now, Tyreek Hill's future in the NFL is uncertain. He remains one of the most talented receivers in the league based purely on his physical abilities and production when on the field. But the circumstances of his departure from Miami, combined with whatever the league's review determines, will significantly impact whether and when another team is willing to take on the risk of signing him. Sources say several teams have had internal discussions about Hill's availability, and that those discussions have been complicated by the lack of clarity about what actually happened in Miami and what assurances, if any, a team could get that similar issues wouldn't arise again. The dark truth of why the Miami Dolphins kicked out Tyreek Hill may never be fully known publicly, but the shadows it casts are already affecting his career in ways that will take months or years to fully resolve. The Miami Dolphins released Tyreek Hill not because of football, but because of a dark truth involving serious allegations that triggered an internal investigation and forced ownership to choose between talent and risk. The real reasons are sealed behind legal agreements, but what's leaking suggests behavior serious enough that keeping him was indefensible. Hill's NFL future now hangs in the balance as teams wrestle with whether his talent is worth the uncertainty about what actually happened in Miami, and what assurances, if any, a team could get that similar issues wouldn't arise again. The dark truth of why the Miami Dolphins kicked out Tyreek Hill may never be fully known publicly, but the shadows it casts are already affecting his career in ways that will take months or years to fully resolve.